Going once.
Going twice.
I bid all I have. Sold.
To the farmer.
Don't worry, little one. You're safe now.
She had no name left, just a number. Lot 47. Burned across her collarbone in industrial ink the color of old blood. And the auctioneer didn't even bother describing her. Just gestured toward the cage and said, "Damaged. Starting bid is 1 credit. We'd rather not pay disposal fees." The crowd laughed. Every alien in that room laughed, except one man, a human, a farmer, a nobody. And what he did next changed the rules of an entire galaxy. Today you're going to hear the full story of Eli Marsh and the girl who came to be called Ash. How a sunburned Iowa corn farmer walked into the most prestigious alien slave market in the Valorian sector and didn't just outbid the room. He walked out owning the moral high ground of an entire civilization. You're going to find out what that auction house actually was, who ran it, and why every species in the galaxy had already decided to look the other way. You're going to find out who Eli Marsh was, why he was there, and what was going through his head the exact moment he stood up. And you're going to find out what happened after. Because the story doesn't end when the gavel drops. It ends when a galaxy has to decide what kind of place it wants to be. Stay with me. This one matters. Let's set the stage. Because if you don't understand the room, you don't understand the choice. The Valorian sector sits about 600 light years from Earth, close enough that when humanity got invited to the Galactic Compact, a handful of humans made the jump within the first decade. Not ambassadors, not generals. Farmers mostly. Agricultural consultants. The Compact needed someone who could grow food in alien soil without killing an ecosystem. And humans, stubborn, adaptable, relentlessly practical, turned out to be surprisingly good at it. The sector capital, a station called Orveth Prime, was beautiful if you didn't look too closely. Curved towers of bioluminescent glass, gravity corridors that hummed like distant music, restaurants where you could eat dishes assembled from ingredients pulled from 40 different worlds. It had that polished, civilized glow that powerful places always have. The kind of shine that exists specifically so you don't notice the shadow underneath it. The House of Lots was in that shadow. Technically, it wasn't a slave market. The Valorian legal framework had never quite classified it that way. Instead, it operated under something called indentured labor procurement, a phrase so clinical and bureaucratic that most compact species had simply agreed to stop asking follow-up questions. It was easier. It kept trade routes open. It kept the credits flowing. The beings sold in the House of Lots were almost always from fringe worlds. Species that hadn't made it into the Compact yet, or that had fallen out of it, or that existed in that quiet, legal gray zone where nobody powerful enough cared to intervene. Skarathi, Yenfolk, Burned Rim colonists from the Ashward Belt. That's where she came from, the Ashward Belt. 3 years before the auction, the belt had gone through something the Compact officially called an atmospheric incident. What that meant in practice was that a terraforming corporation, majority owned by 3 Compact member species, had miscalculated a thermal dispersal on a belt colony and cooked the upper atmosphere. 17,000 people, gone in a day. The ones who survived the initial event spent the following weeks running from radiation and firestorms and trying to keep their children alive in underground shelters made from whatever they could find. The girl who would become Lot 47 was one of those children. She was 14, maybe 15. The Skarathi aged poorly under stress, and it was hard to tell. Her scales, which in a healthy Skarathi adult should be iridescent blue-green, were mottled and scarred from the burns. 3 of her 4 upper limbs were fully functional. The 4th had contracted during healing. The joint fused at an angle that made it difficult to extend. Her crest, the sensory fin that Skarathi wear along the ridge of their skull, was partially melted on the left side. She was brought to the House of Lots by a recovery crew that worked for the same corporation that had cooked her planet's atmosphere. Nobody considered the irony worth commenting on. Not out loud, anyway. At the House of Lots, she was catalogued, cleaned, in the way that a storage container gets cleaned, not the way a person does. Assigned the number 47 and placed in a lot with 4 other Skarathi survivors. When the lot was broken up by buyer interest, she was the one left over. Nobody wanted damaged goods, even at a discount, even at 1 credit. That's the world Eli Marsh walked into. Now I want you to think about something for a second. Every single species in that auction house, the Valorians, the Trethkai merchants, the compact observers who were technically there to monitor conditions, every single one of them considered themselves civilized. They had universities. They had philosophy. They had art forms that could make you cry in frequencies you didn't know you had. And they were about to let a burned child be disposed of because her opening bid was too low. What does it say about civilization when the most humane person in the room is the newcomer? The species everyone else is still calling primitive? I'll tell you what it says. But first, let me tell you about the man. Eli Marsh did not look like a hero. He was 43 years old, 6 feet tall, with the kind of build that comes from decades of actual physical labor. Not gym labor, farm labor, which is different in the way that a working dog is different from a show dog. Calloused hands. A jaw that had been broken once in a tractor accident and hadn't healed quite straight. Hair the color of weathered wheat, kept short because it was practical. He wore clothes he'd bought at a station outfitter. Nothing fancy, nothing that read as money because he didn't have much and he had no desire to pretend otherwise. He was on Orveth Prime because a compact agricultural cooperative had hired 3 human consultants to evaluate soil regeneration techniques on a station-adjacent grow ring. Eli was the lead consultant. His 2 colleagues were spending their off hours doing what most humans did on their first extended trip to a sector capital. Gawking, eating, collecting stories to tell back home. Eli had been doing the same, more or less. He'd gone to the market district because he wanted to look at the seeds. A Valorian grain variation that was reportedly drought-resistant in ways that Earth agroscience was still figuring out. He'd bought a bag of them. He'd been heading back to the consultant quarters. The House of Lots was on his route. He hadn't known what it was. The sign above the entrance was in 3 compact scripts, and he only read one of them passably. What he saw when he looked through the arched doorway was a large, well-lit room with rows of seating, not unlike an auction barn. He'd been to plenty of those back in Iowa. Livestock sales, estate auctions. The smell was different here, stranger, more antiseptic, but the architecture of the thing was familiar. He walked in because he was curious. He found a seat near the back because that's where farmers sit. You don't want to be near the front at an auction you don't fully understand, because an auctioneer can misread a scratch of your nose as a bid, and suddenly you own a broken combine. His translator implant, a low-grade unit he'd gotten as part of the consultation contract, was working mostly. It clipped some of the nuance, but it got the words. He sat through 3 lots before lot 47 came up. The first 2 he watched with growing unease. Something in his chest was tightening, the way it does when you know something is wrong before your brain has finished processing what your eyes are seeing. He told himself he was misunderstanding. The translator was imperfect. These were probably, labor contracts? Some kind of work placement? Maybe this was normal here and he just didn't know the context. But when they brought her out, he understood. There was no ambiguity anymore. She was small, Even for a Skarathi juvenile, she was small. Malnutrition does that. Or maybe just the weight of what she'd been through. She stood in the lot space the way prey animals stand in the open. Not moving, not making eye contact. Making herself as small and unthreatening as possible because that strategy had kept her alive this far, and she had no reason to believe it wouldn't keep working. The auctioneer said his line. Damaged goods. 1 credit starting bid, a few laughs. Eli's translator rendered it all in flat American Midwestern English, and he felt something go cold and very clear in his mind. He didn't deliberate. That's the part he would emphasize. Later, when people asked him, he didn't weigh options. He didn't consider consequences. He didn't calculate. He just stood up. And in a voice that carried, the voice of a man who'd spent 30 years calling across wind-blown fields to workers 200 yards away, he said, 200 credits. The room went quiet. Not the polite quiet of a paused conversation. The paralyzed quiet of a room that has just witnessed something it doesn't have a category for. Because here's what you need to understand. 200 credits in the Valorian sector wasn't a fortune. Not by compact standards, but it was 200 times the opening bid for an item that the auctioneer had essentially announced was garbage. It was the bid of someone who didn't understand the rules, or of someone who didn't care about them. And standing in the back row, in a station-bought jacket with grain seeds in his pocket, was a human, a species that had been in the compact for 11 years. A species that most compact members still referred to, politely, as developmentally nascent. That human had just made every single being in that room look at what they were doing. Hold on. Because it gets more complicated before it gets cleaner. 200 credits created a problem. Not for Eli. He had that amount, barely. And he'd made the bid before thinking too hard about his bank balance. Which was not the most financially sound approach, but was perhaps the most human one. The problem it created was for everyone else in the room. Because the moment the bid was real, the auction was real. And if the auction was real, then what was being sold was real. And if what was being sold was real, then everyone who had been sitting in comfortable silence watching it happen had a choice to make about what that said about them. A Trethkai merchant in the 3rd row, heavy-set, wearing the kind of layered robes that meant either serious wealth or serious pretension, turned around to look at Eli. His translator captured the tone, even if it softened the exact words. The meaning was clear. Who are you, and do you understand what you're doing? Eli said he understood fine, thank you. The auctioneer, to his credit, or perhaps just to his professional instincts, continued. 200 credits. From the gentleman in the back. Do I have 250? Silence. And here's where it gets interesting. Because a Valorian official in the 5th row, a mid-level bureaucrat named Thessaly Vorn, whose name would later appear in rather a lot of compact reform documents, raised his paddle. Not because he wanted the girl, because he wanted to see what the human would do. 250, the auctioneer called. Eli didn't hesitate. 500. Another silence. Longer this time. Vorn raised his paddle again. 600. This was theater now. Vorn had more money than Eli by a factor of several hundred. Everyone in the room knew it. This was a test. Could the primitive human be priced out of his sentimental gesture? Would he fold when the numbers got real? Would he retreat to his seat with his dignity moderately intact and let the adults handle things? Eli looked at Vorn. Vorn looked at Eli. Eli said, 1,000. He had 942 credits in his account. He had said 1,000. He was technically lying. And he was also absolutely committed to the lie, which perhaps explains a great deal about the human relationship with authority. The room shifted. Something changed in the quality of the silence. The Trethkai merchant had put down his program. Two compact observers who had been performing careful boredom were now watching openly. A Skarathi female near the aisle, not a buyer, a staff member of the House of Lots, which became important later, had gone very still. Vorn looked at Eli for a long time. Then he lowered his paddle. Not because he couldn't match the bid, because he'd gotten what he came for. He'd wanted to see if the human would hold. The human had held. And now Thessaly Vorn had a decision to make about what that meant. A decision that would, as it happened, consume the better part of the next 2 years of his career. The auctioneer called it. Once, twice, 3 times. Sold. Lot 47 to the human in the back row, 1,000 credits. Eli Marsh had 58 credits left in his account. He walked to the collection desk with the seed bag under his arm and the calm expression of a man who had absolutely no plan and was not going to let anyone see that. Here is the first thing that happened after the gavel fell. The Skarathi staff member, the female who had gone still during the bidding, crossed the room to the collection desk and spoke very quietly to Eli in what his translator rendered as, "You should know that what you just did has been witnessed." He said, "I'd hope so, that was the point." She said, "I mean witnessed in the formal sense. Under compact law, witnessed acts of social intervention can be entered into the record. I am a licensed compact observer embedded in this facility. I have been embedded here for 11 months. You are the first person in 11 months to do anything that required me to open my record-keeping tools." Eli didn't fully understand what that meant yet. He would. What happened next is why this story doesn't end with the gavel. They took him to a holding area to complete the paperwork, which he could not fully read, and which a bored Valorian clerk translated with the specific exhaustion of someone processing routine transactions. He signed where indicated. He paid the 1,000 credits via transfer that briefly left his account in the negative before a separate work stipend payment processed simultaneously, which he had not planned, but which he later described as the universe deciding to cooperate. And then they brought her out. She was wearing a gray transit garment, the kind of anonymous, one-size garment that institutions put on people when they want to minimize the sense that those people are individuals. Her crest lay flat against her skull, in the Skarathi posture that Eli's translated cultural notes would later tell him indicated deep submission, the behavioral equivalent of making yourself invisible. She did not look at him. He didn't know the Skarathi greeting posture. He didn't know the correct form of address for a juvenile. He didn't know what he was doing, not exactly, which he recognized as a genuine problem that needed to be solved through direct conversation rather than improvisation. So he sat down on the floor, not ceremonially, not as a grand gesture, just because sitting on the floor meant he was lower than she was, and his mother had taught him that when you want someone to know you're not a threat, you make yourself small. It works on nervous animals, it works on nervous people, and he didn't have enough information yet to know which category applied. But the principles seemed sound either way. He put the seed bag between them. He said, in his best translated approximation of a low-tone, non-aggressive Valorian greeting, which probably came out with a terrible accent, "You don't have to be afraid. I don't know what's supposed to happen next either." Silence. Then, very quietly, in a voice that had clearly not been used much lately, "You paid money for me." "I did. Why?" Not a question exactly. More like a statement awaiting correction. as if she expected him to reveal the real reason, and it would be something comprehensible and transactional and terrible. He thought about how to answer that. He thought about the theological and ethical frameworks he could reach for. He thought about his mother and his grandfather and the particular stubborn morality of people who grow things for a living, who understand that some things you do simply because the alternative is not something you're willing to be. He said, because no one else was going to. She looked at him for the first time. Her eyes, Skarathi eyes, were compound and slightly luminescent, a quality that radiation damage had unevenly affected. So one eye was dimmer than the other, fixed on him with an expression that his human face-reading brain translated as something between suspicion and a hope so fragile it was afraid to be felt. He reached into the seed bag and pulled out one of the Valorian grain seeds, small, dark purple, hard as a pebble, and held it out on an open palm. "I'm an agricultural consultant," he said. "That means I help things grow in places where they're not supposed to be able to. I don't know if that's useful information to you right now, but it's what I do." She looked at the seed. She didn't take it, but she didn't move away from it either. That, Eli would later tell people, was the most hopeful thing he had seen in a long time. Now here's what happened in the 6 hours after that meeting. Because the consequences of standing up in a room full of people who've decided something is acceptable don't end when you stand up. That's not how consequence works. In those 6 hours, Thessaly Vorn filed a formal query to the Compact Legal Bureau asking for a review of the House of Lot's operational classification. The Skarathi staff observer submitted her 11 months of embedded documentation as a formal evidentiary submission. 3 separate Compact media feeds ran the auction surveillance footage under headlines that ranged from "Human Defies Convention at Indentured Labor Sale" to "Is the House of Lots Legal?" to, and this one Eli found particularly uncomfortable, "Humanity's Moral Awakening. Are Earth species more civilized than we thought?" And a communication arrived at the consultant quarters addressed to Eli Marsh from a Skarathi advocacy collective operating out of the Ashward Belt refugee settlements. The subject line was 4 words. She had a name. Her name was Veska. Veska Arthen, from the settlement of Coldren Station, Ashward Belt, a mining and agricultural colony that no longer existed as of 3 years prior. Her mother had been a soil engineer. Her father had worked in atmospheric processing, an irony so cruel it felt like the universe testing the limits of its own metaphors. She had a younger brother named Paul, who had been sold in a different lot 6 months earlier, and whose current location was unknown. She had liked mathematics before the incident. She had been learning to draw in a technique that combined Skarathi scale pressure art with something she'd adapted from human comic illustration, because a human family had lived in Cold Run Station for 2 years, and their daughter had shared her sketchbooks. None of this was in the House of Lots' file. The House of Lots file said, "Lot 47. Damaged. 1 credit starting bid." The Skarathi Advocacy Collective sent all of this information to Eli because they had watched the footage, and they had one question. What was he going to do now? Eli sat in the consultant quarters with this information and a cold cup of something that was probably coffee adjacent, and thought about it for a long time. He was a consultant on a 6-month contract. He had a farm back in Iowa, not big, not profitable in the way that would impress anyone, but his. He had a sister, 2 nephews, a dog named Barley, who was probably wondering where he'd gone. He was not equipped to be a galactic civil rights figure. He also could not put that communication down. He wrote back to the collective. He asked about Paul. He asked what Veska needed, medically, legally, practically. He asked what the process was for the advocacy group to formally request compact intervention in the House of Lots operations, and whether his testimony would be useful. The collective responded within the hour. They had been waiting 11 months for someone with standing to ask those questions. They had been waiting for someone who had participated in the system, who had literally purchased from it, to turn around and testify against it. That standing was, under compact law, exceptionally powerful. Eli spent the next 3 days in meetings he was not remotely prepared for. He also spent pieces of those 3 days with Vesa, who was being housed temporarily by the advocacy collective while her legal status was formally transitioned. She still didn't talk much. She watched him a great deal. She had, at some point, taken one of the Valorian grain seeds from the bag and was carrying it in the fold of her transit garment. And he didn't comment on this because he understood, in the way that farmers understand, that you don't draw attention to a thing that's growing. On the 4th day, she asked him what soil felt like. He told her. He described it badly. He was better with his hands than with words. But he tried. He talked about the weight of it and the temperature and the way good soil has a smell like something that's alive and waiting. He talked about barley digging in the garden, and when he thought no one was watching, and emerging with dirt on his nose, looking extremely pleased with himself. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "My mother said that the belt could have been farmland. Before the incident, she said the soil had potential." He said, "She was probably right." Vesa said, "Do you think it could still be?" And Eli Marsh, 43 years old, calloused hands, jaw broken once by a tractor, looked at a burned alien girl in a gray transit garment carrying one of his seeds, and made the second unplanned decision of his trip to Orveth Prime. "I don't know," he said, "but I could find out." Thessaly Vorn's inquiry triggered a review that resulted in the House of Lots being reclassified and then shut down within 14 months. The evidentiary submission from the embedded observer was central to the case. So was Eli's testimony. Paul was found. It took 8 months, a coalition of 3 advocacy groups, and a compact legal mechanism that had technically existed for 40 years but had never been successfully invoked before. He was found. The Ashward Belt Reclamation Project, which Eli did not run because he knew his limits, but which he consulted for because that was what he knew how to do, broke ground in its first test site 2 years after the auction. Vesa Arthen, who was by then 18, was one of the first people to work that soil. Eli sent her a full set of proper agricultural tools from Iowa. She sent him back a drawing. It was in her hybrid technique, Scarathi and human, pressure and ink. And it showed a pair of hands, one human and heavily calloused, one Scarathi and scarred, both of them holding a seed. He framed it and hung it in the farmhouse, next to the window that looks out over the fields he still plants every spring, because some things you do because the alternative is not something you're willing to be. One man stood up. That's how it starts. It always is. If you want to keep going. There's a story about what happened when Eli was asked to testify before the full compact assembly, and what he said when a Valorian delegate asked him why humans seemed constitutionally incapable of looking away from injustice. His answer was 11 words long, and it shut the room down completely. Comment below if you want that one. See you next time.